The original Famicom Detective Club released back in 1988 for the Famicom Disk System, an add-on for the Japanese version of the NES. The idea was that the extra space granted by the disk system's, disks, would allow for the development of bigger games. A lot of the NES staples like Legend of Zelda and Metroid were originally for the disk system, and were later ported to cartridge form in the West. Plenty of disk system games were translated and released outside of Japan on regular cartridges, but the sheer volume of text involved in an adventure game like Detective Club is probably one reason why it never left its country of origin. The games themselves were so massive they had to have multiple releases for one story. The Missing Heir released in April and June of 1988, and The Girl Who Stands Behind was released in April and May of the following year. The Girl Who Stands Behind was also given a visual makeover in an updated Super Famicom port in 1998, released only through a download-only cartridge system that Nintendo was testing around in Japan. Both of these games also received Game Boy Advance ports in 2004 as part of a retro re-release campaign that Nintendo was doing overseas as well. I imagine most Western fans were introduced to Detective Club through Smash Bros., where the female lead of the two games is represented with a trophy. But now there's finally an official version of both Detective Club stories on the Switch. Nintendo teamed up with the prolific adventure game studio Mages to update and re-release the two Famicom Detective Club stories onto their newest console. Even if you don't know who Mages are, you've probably seen one or two of their games pop up on a store shelf or online marketplace. They've been in the adventure game market for almost a decade and a half now. My point being that Nintendo didn't cut corners when it came to remaking these two crime drama visual novels. They went with who they assumed were probably going to do it the best. There really isn't too much to talk about with the two Detective Club games when it comes to reviewing them. Both are classic text adventures. Gameplay is mostly navigating dialogue trees outside of one or two extreme examples. When I said Nintendo didn't cut any corners, I meant that in the most literally figurative way possible. Of all the things that were improved from 1988 to 2021, the gameplay was not one of those. Characters will often speak in broken sentences, requiring the player to continually select prompts over and over to continue story dialogue. It can get annoying to shift through the amount of possible choices the game gives, and oftentimes I found myself falling back onto the just go through everything until it works mindset that often plagued text adventures and point-and-click games from decades ago. It really kind of hurts knowing that someone at either Nintendo or Mages was like, okay, we're going to make these beautiful semi-animated character portraits, create all of these amazing looking updated backgrounds, rework the soundtrack to match the Switch hardware, but keep the gameplay the exact same as almost 30 years ago. The navigation became a really big hang-up for me in both titles, where at one point I found myself stuck for the better half of 30 minutes, figuring out which option at which scene I needed to hit to advance. In one of the later chapters of The Girl Who Stands Behind, I had to meet up with a teacher to discuss something, but when I went to the teacher's office, I was told they had stepped out and would be back later. I meandered between all of the areas with NPCs that I could talk to, and selected anything that I felt was relevant to the story at the moment, but the actual trigger for meeting with said teacher wasn't in the office, or a classroom. It was exhausting a bunch of otherwise useless choices in a location where even the game told me that no one was around. I think a few easy ways to fix these problems can be summed up like this. Combine all of the dialogue into one simple prompt rather than have the player repeatedly go through the same options over and over again. Also, there should be some kind of system that lets the player know when all of a prompt's responses have been used up. It doesn't need to be something blaring or easily noticeable. It can be subtle, like just darkening the letters on an exhaustive choice would be enough to clue the player in that they could ignore that choice. Despite my gripes with the UI, the story of the games is wonderfully engrossing. They're not something I'd have expected from Nintendo, especially not modern Nintendo and its big focus on appearing family-friendly. These are surprisingly dark and gritty murder scenarios with some pretty horrific scenes existing in both games. It's nothing like body horror or even slasher film levels of blood and corniness, but there were definitely some scenes I didn't expect to see. Both games had multiple points where I felt slightly unnerved from either the visuals or the story itself. Having not played any of the earlier iterations of the game, I'm really curious how these scenes were handled there. I wouldn't necessarily label these games as horror, but they certainly have a nice amount of horror elements to them. The pacing in both games is also excellently done. Maybe it's because these games came from the disk system's limited storage and everything there had to be cut down to just the essentials, but the plot rarely meanders long in either game. If there is any excess fluff, it's very short-lived. Both games do a great job of hopping from beat to beat. Even though each game is divided into chapters, I rarely felt like said chapters were a good stopping point. That's just how much it pulled me in. Each ended with just enough mystery or tension that I wanted to keep playing. In fact, I finished The Missing Heir over the course of about 2 days. Thematically, The Missing Heir is much like a serious crime drama, with little bits of lighthearted comedy sprinkled about. The Girl Who Stands Behind is also very good in the same way. It mixes a lot of happy and sad vignettes together to create a story that shifts around from goofy school comedy to grim thriller, but it never dips so hard into the former that it ruins the pacing of the latter. There are a lot of great twists, and I was pleasantly surprised when parts of the mystery I tried to reason on my own ended up getting flipped around by what actually happened. Each game only takes about 8 or 9 hours to complete, and they can be purchased individually for about $35 or together in a bundle for $60. That price might seem a bit steep, but the quality of these games matches what's being paid for. I already mentioned how the character portraits are lightly animated, but there's also a superb voice cast behind every single character. The voices are Japanese only, which might be off-putting to someone hoping for an English dub, but that's not really a deal breaker for me. The games also offer options to switch between different soundtracks. The Missing Heir has its remix Switch soundtrack as well as its original 8-bit version. The Girl Who Stands Behind has the remix and Famicom versions, but also includes the remix soundtrack from the Super Famicom port as well. In short, both Detective Club games are great, even if the gameplay is still stuck in the Japan bubble era that they were originally crafted in. The story, art, and voice acting all carry each game to make them worth playing, and I hope Nintendo decides to either collab with Mages to make new adventure games, or potentially revive some of their other old ones.